Hi, I'm Lena.
He stood in the audience, smiling like he belonged there, like he hadn't stolen everything that was supposed to be mine. From the outside, no one could tell. To them, he was just another proud sibling watching his sister win. But I could feel the heat of his guilt, buried beneath the perfect suit and charming applause. This moment was supposed to be his. At least, that's what the world believed. But the truth was simple. He had taken credit for my invention. And now, he was about to watch me receive the award he lied about. People often assume betrayal comes with noise, shouting, slammed doors, dramatic showdowns. But the most painful betrayals are quiet. They happen in still rooms with polite words and familiar faces. Mine began in the garage of our old house, with a rusted workbench, a dozen failed experiments, and a notebook full of dreams I hadn't yet dared to speak aloud. I wasn't the kind of girl who stood out. Not in a room, not in a family photo, not even in my own memories. I was the girl who stayed up late, who whispered ideas to herself while others talked over dinner. My world was equations and diagrams, pieces of a puzzle I was sure no one else could see. Except him. My brother Liam was older, louder, brighter. The kind of boy who could charm teachers without turning in his homework. He was good at everything, or at least that's how it looked from where I stood. When he came home for the summer during my junior year, he found me hunched over a pile of circuit boards, scribbling notes in my journal like my life depended on it. He didn't laugh. Not at first. He asked questions. He hovered. He offered advice. And I let him in. Because he was my brother. Because I didn't know what danger looked like when it wore a familiar face. The invention was a small device meant to filter microplastics from contaminated water. Simple in theory, impossible in practice. Or so everyone told me. But I knew I was close. I had tested it dozens of times, and every failure taught me something new. Liam watched me work late into the night. Sometimes he brought me snacks. Sometimes he stayed and listened. I remember one evening when he asked if he could take my notes to show a professor he respected.
Just to get feedback, he said.
I hesitated for less than a second before handing over the journal. It never came back. A few months later, I heard his name announced at a local tech startup pitch competition. The invention had a new name, but the core technology was mine. The device, the concept, the filtration pattern, it was all there, lifted word for word from my original plans. I watched him on stage, grinning like he'd built it with his own two hands. He even used a phrase I'd written in the margins of my notes, affordable purity for the future. I felt like the ground had split open.
But I didn't say anything.
I wasn't ready. I wasn't even sure I could prove it. And part of me still wanted to believe it was a mistake, that he'd come back and explain, apologize, make it right. Instead, he went bigger. That pitch became a feature in a regional tech magazine. That article became a TEDx talk. Then came funding. Investors. A spot on a startup incubator list for young innovators under 25. My brother was suddenly a star. At home, our parents couldn't stop talking about how proud they were. My mother clipped the articles. My father joked about being related to a genius. And I sat there every night at dinner, smiling through teeth clenched, so tight I gave myself headaches. When I finally confronted him, months later, he looked me dead in the eyes and told me to be realistic. He said no one would have taken it seriously if it came from me. That he had the voice, the contacts, the reputation. That he didn't steal it, he launched it. I could barely breathe. He told me I should be grateful, that I could still be a part of it if I stayed quiet. Help him improve the next model. Work behind the scenes. Like an assistant to my own idea. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling for hours, feeling like I had disappeared completely. Like I didn't exist outside of his version of the truth. But silence is only power when you choose it. And I had been silent long enough. I started over. Not out of revenge, but survival. I redesigned the device, improved its efficiency, refined the material components, and removed every trace of the original version that had been credited to him. I applied under a different name to a science grant program with global reach. I submitted prototypes, progress reports, and data logs that proved the development was mine. I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents. Not my friends. I worked in secret, funded by odd jobs and scholarships, refusing to let bitterness infect the one thing I still loved: creation. When I got accepted as a finalist for the award, I felt something shift. Not pride. Not satisfaction. Just calm. Like I'd finally found the ground again. I still hadn't told Liam. I wanted him to find out the way I found out he stole from me, in public, with nowhere to run. The night of the award ceremony was warm and quiet. The venue was packed with industry professionals, journalists, and dozens of finalists who had poured their lives into ideas that could change the world. I stood backstage, holding the small controller that triggered the demo of my device, hands steady, heartbeat slow. I didn't look at the crowd until my name was announced. When I stepped onto the stage and saw Liam's face in the third row, everything fell into place. The panic in his eyes, the realization, the fear. He clapped because he had to. Everyone else was.
But I saw his jaw lock.
I saw the weight of what he'd done settle on his shoulders. The truth was in the room now, and it didn't need to scream. When I started my presentation, I didn't mention him. I didn't have to. I spoke about the science, the impact, the journey. I shared the story of how the invention evolved, how I rebuilt it from scratch after losing everything. I watched his eyes widen when he realized what I was saying, without saying it. And then, as the audience rose in applause, I let my gaze fall on him one more time. Not to gloat, but to remind him. I was never gone. He just stopped looking. What I didn't know then was that this moment would only be the beginning. That once the story hit the headlines, once people started asking questions, the past would crawl out of the shadows in ways I hadn't prepared for. Because when you take back what's yours, the ones who stole it don't let go quietly. And Liam had buried more than just the truth.
After the award ceremony, I thought the storm had passed.
But recognition doesn't just open doors. It also cracks the windows where shadows sneak in. The morning after my presentation, the headlines were already picking up steam. Most of them celebrated the technology, the science, the achievement. But one article, tucked between tech blogs and science columns, used the phrase, emerging inventor with a familiar design. It didn't mention Liam directly. It didn't have to. I knew that someone had started pulling threads, and I knew exactly who would panic first. I didn't hear from him for 3 days. Not a call. Not a message. Not even a sarcastic post online, which was his favorite way to take subtle jabs. But on the 4th day, I received an email from a journalist at a major tech publication. She said she was doing a piece on the award, and during her research, she'd noticed similarities between my filtration system and an earlier one registered under my brother's name. She wanted to give me a chance to respond. Her tone was neutral. Curious, not accusing. But I could see where it was heading. Liam had spoken first.
Or someone in his circle had.
Either way, a narrative was already forming. I called Elias, the legal consultant I had quietly partnered with during my redevelopment process. He had reviewed my work, my documentation, and helped me protect everything with clean, time-stamped patents. He was calm when I showed him the journalist's message. He told me not to respond yet. Let them publish what they want, he said. The truth was traceable. But I wasn't so sure that truth was enough. People believe the version that reaches them first. And Liam had been ahead of me for years. Later that night, I opened my old laptop and dug into the folder I had locked away. My original recordings. The late-night journal entries. The rough video logs of failed experiments. The footage of me in our garage, adjusting wires and muttering frustrations. I uploaded several files to a secure drive and labeled it proof, just in case. It felt like building a bunker, even though the war hadn't started yet. But something inside me knew it would. What I didn't expect was the next twist to come from someone else entirely. I got a message from my old high school lab partner, Kayla. We hadn't spoken in years. She had moved states, dropped out of science altogether, and taken up photography. Her message was short and strange. Hey, I know this is random, but check your patent submission. You might not be the only name on it. I blinked at the screen. My heart tightened as I logged into the system where my project files and intellectual property were registered. Everything had been filed through the innovation board Elias helped me access. But when I looked, my name had been recently joined by a second one.
Co-inventeur, El Marin.
My stomach dropped. The timestamp was just 2 days old. Someone had tried to edit the record. It wasn't a legal change. It hadn't gone through the verification process. But the fact that his name appeared there at all meant someone had hacked into the filing system or manipulated access. I called Elias immediately. He was already pacing on the other end before I finished explaining. He told me to take screenshots, download logs, and forward everything to his office. This wasn't just arrogance now. This was criminal. We initiated a formal request to the IP board to investigate access logs. Within 48 hours, the board confirmed that someone had used a flagged login from an unverified IP address tied to Liam's former university lab. The digital trail was messy, but it was there. When the results came in, Elias called me and said quietly, "He's not just trying to reclaim your idea. He's trying to rewrite history." That same evening, an anonymous tip landed in my inbox. No name, no subject line, just a PDF attached, titled, "He Knew What He Was Doing." I opened it, hands trembling slightly. It was a scanned notebook, pages from a lab log written in Liam's handwriting. Except these weren't from after he had taken my idea. They were dated before. Months before he ever asked for my notebook.
It was a strategy plan.
Not for development, but for positioning. A list of contacts. Talking points. Potential investors who liked buzzwords like young innovator and charismatic founder. Beside one bullet point he had written, "Keep her close until it's filed. Don't let her see the pitch deck." I stared at the screen, frozen. My brother hadn't just taken an opportunity. He had built a system to shut me out while pretending to support me. All the nights he asked me to explain things again. All the questions he asked about how to frame it. All the false encouragement. It wasn't collaboration. It was surveillance. Elias urged me to act. Not with revenge, but with precision. We filed a formal claim to have his name permanently dissociated from my patent. We submitted the digital trail, the forged update attempt, the stolen log pages, and the manipulated metadata. The legal board acknowledged the claim and scheduled a review. But in the meantime, the story was breaking wide open. A journalist at TechWire published an exposé called "The Silence Behind the Star," detailing how women in STEM are often written out of their own work. My story was one of 3. Mine had the most evidence. The article went viral. Within hours, people were calling for Liam's funding to be pulled, for awards to be rescinded. But he stayed quiet. He didn't post. He didn't defend. For once, he had no prepared speech. Then came the twist I wasn't ready for. My mother called. I hadn't spoken to her much since the truth started surfacing. She had always loved both of us, but it was no secret Liam had been her golden child. I expected denial. I expected excuses. Instead, she sounded shaken. She told me that someone had broken into their house the night before, not to steal money or jewelry, but to remove a single box from the attic. My old journals. The ones I hadn't seen in years. The ones I thought I'd left behind. My mother said she remembered hearing Liam on the phone a week before, asking if they still had her early sketches. She hadn't thought much of it. Now she did. I felt sick. The past wasn't safe. Not even in storage. I realized then that Liam wasn't done. Not until he destroyed any trace of who had been there first. And I wasn't about to let him. I didn't think I'd cry over a cardboard box. But when my mother told me it was gone, the box from the attic with my earliest diagrams, handwritten notes, failed sketches, pieces of my journey, I felt like someone had broken into my memory and stolen the proof that I had ever existed. Those journals weren't part of any patent file. They weren't legal evidence. But they were mine. They held versions of me I barely remembered. Not the girl who had fought for recognition, but the one who was just trying to figure things out. Losing them felt like someone had stolen my teenage years, stripped the fingerprints off my origin story. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing else had been taken. I knew the motive. And I knew the culprit. But the thought of explaining it to a stranger in uniform, only to be met with doubt, made me pause. Instead, I turned to my digital backups because even back then I had scanned some of those pages. Not all, but enough. I pulled them up and started organizing them, matching dates, tying early sketches to final prototypes. I wanted to build a timeline, something unshakable, something no one could erase. 2 days later, Elias called me with an update. The IP board had reviewed the tampering incident and flagged Liam's access as a breach. It wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. The recommendation was clear. He would be banned from applying for or being credited on any related innovations for 5 years. It was a blow to his future, especially with pending grants and investors watching closely. But it wasn't the end. Not yet. What none of us expected was Liam's next move. He went public. Out of nowhere, a carefully produced video dropped on his previously quiet social accounts. A slick background,
Clean lighting.
soft piano music playing underneath. Liam sitting in front of a desk, wearing his signature navy sweater and his perfectly practiced concern. He spoke about misunderstandings, about how innovation can sometimes cross paths, about collaboration that got messy. He never admitted guilt. He didn't even say my name. But the implication was clear. He was the victim of a smear campaign, blindsided by a sibling dispute twisted by the media. I watched the video in silence. My hands didn't shake. My pulse didn't rise. I just watched, like someone staring at a ghost perform tricks it had rehearsed for years. The comments were mixed. Some praised his vulnerability. Others called him out. But the damage was calculated. He had activated doubt again, enough to muddy the story just as it was becoming clear. What he didn't know was that I had already sent everything, screenshots, metadata, audio clips, even a scan of his old notes, to the board overseeing his startup's funding. Not to destroy him, but to expose the full pattern. They launched a quiet internal investigation. Within days, his name was quietly removed from the project leadership page.
No anunciament.
No warning. Just a subtle shift in the shadows. Investors don't like risk. And Liam finally had become one. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with a different kind of attention. A university offered me a guest lecture spot. A foundation reached out to create a grant under my name for young female inventors. But what shook me most was the message from a girl named Mira. She was 16 from another state, working on a water filtration concept of her own. She wrote, "I almost gave up last month. Then I saw your story. Now I think maybe I'm allowed to try again." I stared at that message for hours. Not because it flattered me, but because it reminded me why I started all this in the first place. Not for credit. Not for awards. But because someone had to care enough to solve what no one else wanted to deal with. Clean water. Small solutions. Real impact. It was never about who got to be on stage. It was about who was still working in the shadows after the lights went off. And just when I thought the fight was settling, I got another message. This one came from someone anonymous. No name.
No signature.
Just a sentence. He's planning to sue. Watch your inbox. At first, I thought it was a scare tactic. But 2 days later, I received a notice from Liam's legal team accusing me of defamation, intellectual theft, and reputational sabotage. I laughed out loud. Then I cried. Not because I believed he could win, but because I couldn't believe he was willing to sink this low. Elias called me before I could panic. He told me not to worry. His voice was calm, but edged with fury. He'd already prepared for this. We had dates, records, witnesses, evidence. It would fall apart in court. But he said something else too, something that stayed with me. He said, "Lena, this isn't about court anymore. This is about making sure the world sees you as the creator, not just the survivor." And I understood. Because there's a difference. People love a comeback story, but they forget who you were before the fall. I didn't just want to be the girl who reclaimed her work. I wanted to be the one who owned it from the beginning. That night, I sat down and wrote my own piece. Not a response. Not a rebuttal. Just a truth. I published it on my personal blog, attached to no PR agency, no media team. I told the story the way I lived it. From the garage to the betrayal. From the silence to the spotlight. From the fear to the fight. I ended it with one sentence. They tried to delete me, so I rewrote the whole page. It spread faster than I expected, not because it was sensational, but because it was raw.
Real.
Quiet girls with loud minds found it. So did engineers. So did artists. So did people who had once been written out of their own stories. And while Liam prepared for court, the world started remembering who the real inventor was. The lawsuit wasn't about winning. Not for him. It was a performance, a last-ditch attempt to reclaim the stage he'd been pushed off of. The moment the defamation claim landed, Liam's team released another carefully worded statement to the press, painting him as a misunderstood innovator whose sister had turned a personal disagreement into a public spectacle. He didn't deny the similarities between our work. He called them coincidental overlaps. He didn't claim full authorship anymore. He claimed mutual inspiration. But the documents told a different story.
We had email chains.
Lab footage. Handwritten notes in his own pen, with dates that contradicted his timeline. Elias organized the evidence into a digital presentation so sharp, so undeniable, that even our judge's assistant paused when they reviewed the files. The court date was set, 2 months out. And for the first time, I had something more than proof. I had momentum. But Liam wasn't done. He had one more play. A week before the hearing, I received an unmarked envelope delivered to my building.
No stamp.
No name. Just slid under my door in the middle of the night. Inside was a photo, an old one from our childhood. We were sitting on the back porch, me with a screwdriver in one hand, him holding up a plastic toy car we had taken apart. On the back of the photo, a single sentence was written in faded ink. We used to build together. I stared at the photo for a long time, not because it softened me, but because it reminded me of the one thing I kept forgetting in all this noise. This wasn't just about a thief or a liar. This was about a brother who had decided somewhere along the way that his survival required my silence. And I wasn't sure which version of him was worse, the one who plotted or the one who convinced himself it wasn't personal. The night before court, I couldn't sleep. I didn't rehearse a speech. I didn't scroll headlines. I just sat in my living room, the lights dim, and opened a folder I had never planned to use. A folder labeled Last Resort. Inside were 5 documents, bank statements, emails, and one contract Liam had drawn up years ago with an investor where he claimed full ownership of the invention. It wasn't part of the legal strategy, but it showed intent. Malicious, deliberate, traceable. I sent them to Elias without comment. He replied with just 2 words. This seals it. The courtroom wasn't as dramatic as the movies make it seem.
No scouting. No gasps.
Just tension you could feel in your teeth. Liam sat across from me, dressed in his usual navy, his lawyer whispering in his ear between sessions. He looked thinner. Or maybe smaller. I watched him avoid eye contact as our lawyers laid out the facts, dates, files, timestamps, expert witnesses. Everything clean, clear, irreversible. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a statement, I stood without hesitation. I spoke plainly. I said I wasn't there to destroy my brother. I was there to defend the truth. That women in science don't need more apologies. They need protection. That silence isn't humility when it's weaponized against you. And that no one should have to beg to be credited for their own voice. Liam didn't speak. Not once. His lawyer declined to cross-examine me. He just sat there, hands folded, watching something slip away that he could no longer reach. 2 weeks later, the ruling was announced. The court found Liam guilty of falsifying intellectual property claims, manipulating evidence, and attempting to tamper with official records. He was ordered to issue a formal retraction, forfeit financial gains tied to the original stolen pitch, and pay a portion of the legal fees. But more than that, he was banned from holding executive or creative roles in any patent-backed startup for the next 5 years. He didn't appeal. News outlets ran the story under headlines like "Inventor Wins Back What Was Hers" and "Justice for Innovation." But I didn't read the articles. I didn't go on interviews. I didn't speak to cameras. I had done all the speaking I needed. Instead, I accepted a private invitation to a small STEM mentorship retreat in the mountains. No stage. No press. Just 20 girls from different corners of the country, all under 20, all with ideas that could change the world if given the chance. I taught a few workshops. I listened more than I spoke. And on the last night, one of them handed me a bracelet she had made out of old circuit board strips. On the inside, she had etched a message in tiny engraving: "For the girl who proved being quiet doesn't mean you're wrong." I wore it back to the city. Weeks passed. Life quieted. Liam disappeared from social feeds and news cycles. His startup folded without him, the remaining board issuing a bland apology and pivoting to unrelated tech. My name was now etched cleanly into the system, untouched, unquestioned. My device was being tested by a water sustainability coalition, and one of the prototype units had already been deployed in a village where water had been undrinkable for years. But the real twist came one afternoon, months later, when I got a letter. It was handwritten.
Shaky.
Probably rewritten multiple times. The envelope had no return address, but I knew the handwriting before I opened it. It was from Liam. Inside were 3 pages.
No justifications. No spinning. Just a story.
He told me about the first time he realized people listened to him more than they listened to me. How it felt like power. And then how that power turned into pressure. How he didn't know where the pretending ended. How sorry he was, not just for what he did, but for what he let himself become. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "You were always the builder. I was just louder. I hope someday they see the difference matters. I see it now." I folded the letter and placed it in the back of my journal. Not for forgiveness, just for memory. Because I had made peace with the past, not by erasing it, but by reclaiming it. And soon, the world would see what came next. It's strange how a story can stretch across years, how it can twist and turn and break open old wounds before it finally settles. I used to think justice came with trumpets, headlines, applause. But when it came for me, it arrived in whispers, in quiet victories, in people finally calling me by my name without hesitation. The world didn't need to cheer for me to know I had won. I just needed to stop disappearing every time someone else spoke louder. After the lawsuit, after the media drifted away, and the dust finally settled, I moved into a new apartment on the other side of the city. Nothing dramatic. Just space. A quiet place with tall windows and a creaky floor I could walk across barefoot at midnight when my thoughts got loud. I filled it with small things that reminded me of the person I had been before all of this began. A telescope, half-built circuit boards, and a worn notebook I still scribbled in even when I had nothing left to solve. I started consulting, not just for environmental tech firms, but for universities designing innovation ethics programs. They wanted to hear how it felt to be erased. What warning signs people missed. How to build systems that didn't reward the loudest voices, but protected the quiet ones still building in the background. It was fulfilling in a way I hadn't expected. Not because I got to lecture, but because I saw pieces of myself in every student who sat with their head down and eyes full of ideas they weren't sure were worth sharing. One of the biggest surprises came from a publishing house. They asked if I'd write a book, not a textbook, not a technical manual, but a personal one. A story about how the invention was only part of the journey, and how the real work was reclaiming a voice that had been taken. I said no at first. Then maybe. Then yes. Because if there was one thing I'd learned, it was that silence didn't always protect you. Sometimes it buried you. And I was done being buried. The book didn't become a bestseller. It didn't need to. But the people who found it, they wrote letters. Long ones. From girls in science clubs, from mothers who'd given up on old dreams, from interns whose ideas had been stolen in conference rooms and buried under someone else's slides. They didn't call me a genius. They called me familiar. And that was enough. But the final twist, one I never saw coming, arrived nearly a year later. I was invited to receive a Global Innovation Award for the updated filtration system, which had officially gone into production in 3 developing regions. The award ceremony was quieter than the last one, more mature. Less media frenzy, more policymakers and sustainability leaders. But still it carried weight. The kind of room where your name being said out loud meant something might change in the world. I accepted the award with calm gratitude. Not with fire in my chest, not with a plan to prove anything, just with steady hands and the sense that maybe this was how closure looked, not like a finish line but like an open door. After the ceremony, as I was leaving the stage, a young woman approached me. She introduced herself as one of the new engineers working on the filtration scale models. She said she'd only just joined the team and had been going through the original system notes. I smiled, expecting to hear a question or a technical concern. But what she said instead made me freeze. She told me there was a buried folder inside the original company server, one that had been archived, never deleted. Inside were video calls, planning meetings, early prototype discussions, all recorded. And in one of them, from nearly 5 years ago, Liam had spoken openly about the strategy to push me out. Not just take credit, but rewrite the entire path. He had said, word for word, we'll ease her out slowly. She doesn't have the stomach to fight. Once it's out, she won't want to cause a scene. She'll just vanish. My breath caught, not out of shock, but because it had all been recorded.
Stored.
Preserved like a ghost trapped in a machine, waiting for someone to press play. She offered to send me the files. I accepted. Not to publish. Not to retaliate.
Just to keep.
A final record. A reminder of who I had once trusted and why that trust mattered.
And didn't.
Later that night, I sat alone in my apartment, watching one of the recordings. I didn't cry. I didn't clench my fists. I just watched. Liam looked so young.
So certain.
So small now compared to the version of me he tried to erase. I closed the laptop when it was done and whispered something I hadn't allowed myself to say until then. I'm still here. Months passed. The water filtration system expanded to 3 more countries. Clean water reached places I'll never visit, touched lives I'll never know. And that, more than anything, was the true inheritance of what I built. Not credit, not applause, but impact. Quiet, lasting impact. I never wrote back to Liam after his letter. He sent one more. A shorter one. Just 3 lines. I saw the award. I watched. You deserved it. I hope you're free now. And I was. Because being free doesn't always mean walking away from someone. Sometimes it means no longer needing them to validate the story you already know is true. I donated the original prototype to a science museum for young inventors. I labeled it simply, Filtration Unit 1. Developed by Lena Marin.
No dates.
No drama. Just the name. The rightful one. At the museum's opening, a little girl with tangled curls and big glasses stood staring at it for nearly 10 minutes. Her father gently tugged her arm, but she held firm, eyes fixed, lips moving like she was reading the plaque over and over again. Before they left, she walked over to me without knowing who I was and said, "One day, I'm going to build something that saves people too." I smiled and said, "I know you will." She grinned, ran off, and disappeared into the crowd. And just like that, I knew. This was never just about reclaiming a stolen invention. It was about what happens after you do. It was about planting something in the space where silence once lived, and watching it grow louder than anything that tried to bury it. Because some people take your story, and some people help you write the next one. I had been both. And now, finally, I was neither. I was just me.
Whole.
Visible. And unshakable.